Okay. So just salute everyone. And this is the first FMG open session on the MC13, which just concluded. I mean, I said I got some mixed feelings about this, and Hector said that he has got a more dominant one side of feeling. But anyway, we have launched the FMG. We have launched quite a few. We call it MC13 interviews. So having FMG members and also some invited external experts to talk about different aspects of MC13. And we think it's also good that we have a big panel also to discuss more in depth about the MC13. So that's why on top of the MC13 interview series, we are going to do this one, and hopefully in the next few weeks to do a few more on different aspects in a much with a much kind of big group and more diversified view. So with that, I won't take any of your time. Alex, over to you. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Lou. I welcome all of you. Today, I'll keep it very short because we don't have much time and we have an exciting topic. And we have a fantastic panel as well. Mohan and Alan and Peter and possibly Anabel González shortly. Now I'll give the floor to 10-15 minutes each, and then we'll have, I hope, time for lots of questions and answers. So Mohan, you, by the way, a great friend from way, way back when. A very distinguished diplomat from India. You all have his bio, so I don't need to go through it. And the same goes for the other speakers. Mohan, so why don't we start with you, because you will have to leave. And I'm going to put you on the spot. And the question is, talking to somebody a few days ago, and this person said, I don't understand India. When look at its economy, at its performance, etc. From that point of view, its position should be diametrically opposed to what it is. Constantly saying no. Those were the words of the person characterizing India's position. So, in addition to the views you may have about MC13 and what next, if you can attempt to briefly try to let us understand the position of India and its roots. Where does it come from? Okay, so over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. It's such a pleasure and honor to be addressing such a group of people. I feel there's so much of trade and expertise in this group that it's amazing. So really a pleasure to do this. I don't think I'll need more than 10 minutes, Alejandro. I'm going to spend 5 minutes answering precisely your question, and the next 5 minutes telling you what my assessment of MC13 is. And then I'd much rather that people ask questions and we can have an interactive session. So let me begin by answering your question. I don't want to sound like a salesman for my book, but my book is precisely to answer your question. Actually, I'm being sincere and honest about this. The book is called India's Moment. The book is a bit misleading, but just to give you specifically 2 reasons why India sounds like that. I think I have been making this point for a while, that the strategic and foreign policy discourse of India bears no relationship with the trade policy discourse. So there is a disconnect, and I'm willing to concede that. So India wants a seat at the high table, UN Security Council, which of course you guys will insist on not giving to us. That's a different point altogether, and that's not the purpose of today's meeting. But there is also this issue of India wanting to be a member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. We want to have the agency to be able to even mediate if we can, along with other countries in conflicts like Ukraine and so on. So that puts us in the category of 7 to 10 trillion economy. We are now 4. But that sounds like a 7 trillion economy to me. But if you look at our trade policy discourse in the WTO, we are decidedly sounding like a 2 trillion economy, frankly. So I concede there is a disconnect, and that's a disconnect that India will have to bridge. Now, the specific reasons why we sound like that, I think there are 2 reasons, one of which I have chosen to call in my book the poverty veto. And that is the veto exercised on India's positions in the WTO by 500 million people, at least 500. Some argue it could be much more, but at least 500 million people who live in poverty. And when I define poverty, I'm not using the criterion of the World Bank for extreme poverty, but I'm using the World Bank criterion for what is known as moderate poverty, which is $3 per head per day. If you use $3, then you are looking at a figure like 500 to 600 million people. And this acts as a drag. So the poverty veto is the first reason we do what we do in the WTO. The second reason why we behave like this in the WTO is the extraordinary need for policy space by India, as opposed to other countries of our size and diversity. And there are not too many countries our size and diversity. 20 years ago, China was a bit like India, but China has since left us far behind. So China is a completely different story altogether. Today, I believe India is the only country of its size which has this, which is sui generis. And we need policy space for 3 reasons. One, we are not a treaty ally of any country. So we are not like ASEAN and many others who outsource their security to the United States and then they have a wonderful trading relationship with China. We don't have that luxury. We are the only country surrounded by 2 nuclear-armed neighbors, both of which with which we have an adversarial relationship. You may start wondering why I'm saying this all to a group of people like this. That's because a lot of money, lot of resources goes into the defense funding of India. And that also causes a bit of strain on your trade policy, on your economy, etc. And last but not least, I believe, like I said, we are sui generis. I'm actually, the more I live in India, and like many of you, I lived 40 years of my life outside. So I'm also beginning to understand my country only now. And it seems to me we are 3 countries rolled into one. We are an emerging power. We are a developing country, but clearly, parts of India actually are least developed. And I know what I'm talking about, especially the northern part of India actually compares with least developed countries. I've lived in Congo long enough to know what is the least developed country, and I therefore can relate to that part of India. Now, the combination of all these 3, emerging, developing, and least developed, makes it extremely tough for the government of India to come up with a common or even a coherent position in the WTO, which makes sense. All the time, your trade policy is defensive because of the poverty veto policy space. So we simply cannot say anything about the public stockholding issue because we are feeding 800 million people. How the hell do you expect us to cope with the 10% subsidy you so generously gave to us under the agriculture agreement, while allowing the US and EU to run amok for so many years? So that's just patently unfair in my view. And if you take policy space, we're asking for 25 years in the fishery subsidies issue, which is on the face of it quite absurd, frankly. But then that is the policy space that India apparently wants, because we are a federal structure and it takes time to do things. So that is the first part of your question, Alejandro. Now, since I don't want to be too long and I would rather answer questions that people may have, let me address the second part of the MC13 outcome. The problem, as I see it, having participated in the Lacarte legal drafting group, the problem I see is that you are changing the balance of rights and obligations for countries, frankly. by doing away with the appellate body, you are changing fundamentally what we decided in the legal drafting group on the dispute settlement front. Because if you are now going back to the GATT system, status quo ante of a panel procedure, then that is not what we bargained for in the WTO. So that's problem number one. I believe it robs the multilateral trading system of security and predictability, which is what the automaticity of the dispute settlement mechanism was supposed to bring. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, you're also choosing to go from multilateral to plurilateral. Clearly, multilateral negotiations are not working in the WTO. So the WTO slowly is tilting towards plurilateral. It's true that India and South Africa put their foot down on this investment facilitation for development. But the reason is not the substance of the investment agreement. I don't want anybody in the audience to think we have a problem with the agreement per se. It's the principle, because we believe if we had agreed to this, then the floodgates will be open, and the developed countries and others may just choose to bring a plethora of plurilateral agreements into the WTO. Now, bringing the plethora of plurilateral agreements into the WTO without a dispute settlement mechanism, which brings or which at least contributes to security and predictability, would be a disaster for India, frankly. So my plea to you is, if somehow the dispute settlement mechanism can be fixed by talking to our American friends. I haven't been able to understand what the US wants, but I'm sure there are others here who understand perfectly what the US wants from a dispute settlement mechanism. If so, I'd like to be enlightened, because that is going to be crucial in how India will approach plurilateral agreements in the future. If you don't have an appellate body, if you have only a one-stage panel, GATT panel system, it becomes that much more difficult for countries like India to accept plurilateral agreements, because you will basically throw us to the wolves. You will have a plurilateral agreement, there will be a dispute, but then the GATT panel doesn't solve anything. So you try to, take the panel result and then do bilateral negotiations with your partners. So I think that is where we are. I think this MC13 was very, very, very modest, I thought, in terms of results. But I just want to conclude by saying a lot of India obviously indulges in negotiating posturing. Everybody knows that, and I don't think I'm revealing any secret. But on the issue of agriculture and fisheries, I think the issues are serious. No government in India can really, allow the agriculture agreement to continue like this. I mean, I think it's a patently unfair agreement for India, especially in terms of internal support and domestic subsidies. Something has to be done. We know agriculture agreement was a complicated bilateral negotiation between US and EU. It was arguably the most undemocratic agreement of the Uruguay round, which we all had to lump, because at the end of the day, nobody really participated in it, at least India did not. So I think agriculture and food security is vital. On fisheries, I think you're comparing apples and oranges. To compare the subsidies that India grants with those heavy deep end fishing that EU or China or Taiwan or Japan do is, I think, again, patently unfair. So on these two issues, I don't want anybody to think India is posturing. On the other issues, I will not say anything. But on these two, I think there are very real grave issues at stake for India. And it will be very hard for any government in India to accept an outcome that prejudices either farmers or fishermen to vital electoral constituencies. This is, of course, an election year in India, but even post-elections, it's terribly... We've got farmers on the road as we speak, Alejandro, in Delhi. They're blocking traffic. They want subsidies to be extended. At a time when WTO is telling us do something about it, actually the farmers are demanding exactly the opposite. So there are some grave political issues. But Alejandro, thank you again for this amazing opportunity, and I'm happy to answer questions that colleagues may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohan. I thank you dearly for that explanation of political roots of India's position. and for your frankness and openness and passion explanation of India. Now, I had forgotten to mention your recent book, which I confess I haven't yet read, but I think you made quite a case to download it and read it. I did download it, by the way. But Mohan is a prolific writer. Earlier, he also wrote a fascinating book about his times as a trade negotiator. It's a fascinating view of things he and we went through together throughout the years in the multilateral trading system, and his views of it. Now, Anabel has joined us, but she is she says she's not in a technical position to take the floor. If it's possible, she will tell me, and then I'll give the floor to her. In the meantime, let me turn to Alan, and to put you on the spot with regards to the United States. Just one brief question is, how do you judge the United States position and participation at MC13? Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much. I'm not exactly in the same position as my government. I certainly don't speak for it, and I'm disappointed in it when it comes to multilateralism on the economic side. On the political side, I have more affinity with it. It's now the morning after, officially the morning after MC13. So we wake up and the ball is over, and we have a sober reflection on what we do from here. This was not an MC for the history books. How does it stack up against the prior MCs? MC11 at Buenos Aires, which everybody thought was a disaster at the moment, at least in the press. In fact, I thought was quite good because it broke through to having open plurilateral agreements, and that was a major change. MC12 was noteworthy because of the first half of the fish agreement, because the World Food Program was, at least with respect to its purchases of food, to be exempt from export restrictions, and the moratorium on e-commerce was renewed. Then we come to MC13. The results are far more mixed. It is, I think, a positive that 164 countries in a time of geopolitical and regional stress can come together and say that they're committed to the multilateral trading system. The degree to which they are is open to question, but they said it, and some of them are no doubt sincere. The number one perspective from my point of view was no backsliding, and the U.S. was on the right side on that one, that the moratorium would be renewed, although the language of that renewal is questions the future. That was necessary at the time, and that was not sufficient. This was supposed to be the first reform ministerial, and it was not. All of the deficiencies of the WTO were on display at MC13, all the institutional deficiencies. The world trading system is about disciplines, not permissiveness. I'm at odds with, I understand the problem of India, but there's a whole rest of the world out there, and maybe some exceptions can be made here and there. Doesn't bother me to have a 25-year or some period of coming into effect. My experience was with the multi-fiber agreement, we did not have the courage in the Tokyo round to get rid of it and say, we'll get rid of it in 25 years. And what happened? We didn't agree to that, but we got rid of it in 25 years. So it is possible to come to conclusions between parties that have very difficult perspectives, different perspectives. The WTO, in my view, is not about permissiveness, it's about disciplines. It's not about policy space. Policy space, to me, is the law of the jungle. The United States has just said it wants policy space for the three core elements of the e-commerce negotiations. To me, this was backsliding, unfortunate, and it's not what the WTO is about. It's the state of nature. That's what policy space is. The members are unavoidably going to come to a reckoning, and there are four aspects of institutional reform that I would point out to talk about this morning. First, the negotiating function is hobbled by not having an operational rule of what the Singapore ambassador Hong Sang has called the responsible consensus. That's a minimum. I would go beyond that. I would have it define when consensus is appropriate and when it isn't, but it's a minimum to say it must be responsible. The ministers did not add the already concluded, as was noted, the investment development agreement, investment development facilitation for development agreement to the WTO acquis. What are the ministers going to do now? I would say go ahead and put it into effect and tell Ngozi, you support JSIs, you support the Africa group when it meets, you support a lot of things. Support this agreement. It's open to all. It's not in any Annex 4. We're just doing it, period. That's the state of the factual situation on the ground that we want to create. We're not going to give up. So the question for the ministers, what do you do now? Number two, the WTO is no closer at all to having an agreed binding dispute settlement mechanism. We should not be blinded by an unadopted Molina collection of improvements. They're very fine improvements. They're not what the issue is. The issue is there going to be binding dispute settlement? Is it going to be two-stage? Is it applicable to all? That's what the WTO was largely about. I think imbalanced in favor of dispute settlement, away from negotiation and away from having an executive branch. But nevertheless, that's what was achieved in creating the WTO. There's no negotiation underway that I know of on solving this problem. And no formal process was put into place by the ministers at Abu Dhabi, at least during the WTO era before this ministerial. There was a Walker process. David Walker, the ambassador of New Zealand, was said, go and find out where the consensus lies. And a number of his suggestions were very good. The worst failing in this area for the WTO at MC13, in my view, was the continuation of the fraud of appealing into a non-existent appellate body. There may never be an appellate body, likely not, and appealing to it is unacceptable. And I would hope ministers would say, we do not accept it, at least not after 2024, when we fail to come to a conclusion, which is likely in 2024 I hope not, but there may be no dispute settlement system that is broadly acceptable to the ministers that is put on the table in December of this year, that members will say, we don't accept that result. If you have a panel decision against you as a country and you appeal into the void, we don't recognize that. There is no appeal into the void. The panel is final, unless you came up with an alternative arrangement, like the MPIA or something like it. The MPIA, and I agree with Mohan, the WTO is founded on the right to hold members accountable for the actions that they take that are inconsistent with their obligations. That right today does not exist other than for those who have interim arrangements. And that cannot be what the state of play is in 2025 compared with 2024. Third, transparency. Transparency is insufficient. Notifications are an insufficient means to have transparency, and they're not adequate as is. They're not lived up to. And fourth, there's no proposal to specify the executive functions of the WTO. It was 30 years ago that the WTO was founded with no constitutional convention, without a lot of thought as to what was being created. other than outside of dispute settlement. And they said, oh, we'll get around to specifying what the Director General can do. And I'm not under any illusions that there's going to be a constitutional convention. I think this will be incremental as it comes along. But there's no mandate for an executive. At the World Bank, at the IMF, at the OECD, the executive has a real role. They make proposals. They chair the local ambassadorial corps, an executive director group. What we have is not good enough. And lastly, the areas of actual substantive reforms as opposed to institutional reforms. So we have no agreed program for negotiations on agriculture, just a mandate that is getting rather old from the negotiated on the basis of 1980s trade, which may be, by the way, in some areas better than what we could negotiate today, but in other areas it is not. Food security. There will be a day of reckoning. When will the reckoning come? When people are starving because climate change or severe events, climate events, weather events, bring about famine. And then the WTO will have to react. There is not a program for negotiation on services, although there's a mandate. There's no program for dealing with goods for even environmental purposes. There's no plan to address climate change. How will that happen? We'll back into it with countries being upset about how carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAM, are being applied. The joint statement on e-commerce, a burgeoning area of world commerce. We don't have any rules. And outside of the GATS, which will be argued over to the extent those rules apply, is that really acceptable? The U.S. has done some real damage in its reversal of its position on the core issues of e-commerce. There's no agreement to address industrial subsidies. We're going to address that through cases, through disputes. That I don't think that's the way to proceed. We ought to have deliberations and negotiation. Forced labor, it's a real issue. It's a moral issue. There's no definition of what that means. Is the United States serious about this subject? If it's serious, then you begin to define what is forced labor, and you see whether there's a consensus out there to deal with it. AI, artificial intelligence, going to change the world. We're used to dealing in the trade area with counterfeits. And what's a major part of the problem of AI on the negative side is going to be counterfeits. Are we going to have any disciplines on them? Fish one, of course, the first part of fish remains unratified. So in conclusion, there's no effective institutional reform agenda, really, not underway. We're pretending we have one for dispute settlement, but it says a dispute settlement system accessible to all. Well, that's very nice, but is it applicable to all? That's a difference. So I wonder about the mandate, and we have too little placed on the substantive agenda. None of this will be achieved overnight. I think it will be incremental in terms of progress, but the process should begin now, and it couldn't begin in Abu Dhabi. It's not something that happens instantly at a ministerial. It is something that I hope the leading positive members of the WTO will sit down with actually other key members, including India, including South Africa, and say, what do you need? And get down to a real understanding of how to move forward. So that's my hope. I'm full of hope at this time, but not because of MC13. It's because they left us a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Anabel's still not in a position to take the floor. She's checking out of an hotel, it tells me. Let me turn to Peter Ungphakorn. Peter, you're being a long-standing observer of the world trading system. even to extent of having joined the WTO Secretariat in the media section. And you have a very popular blog, a very good one, I must say. And for those who are interested, you could maybe put the link, place the link in the chat. So be very interesting to have your views as a dispassionate observer of the system. And in particular, how the public opinion, how does the world perceive the WTO, or what about its doings and undoings? Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Alejandro. We go back a long way, and I shared with you some time ago a really old photo where we both look very young and very active. Back to the 90s,
Let me interrupt. I still have a clipping in Bangkok where you worked at the time.
Yes.
Where we had a meeting, precursor of the Cairns Group, and you interviewed me. It was a full page.
Yes.
And the headline was developing countries don't need special and differential treatment.
Was it really? Oh, yes, that's what you said. Yes.
That was 1986.
Yes. Is it okay if I share my screen? I think people would rather see something else rather than my face.
Alex, you're muted, Alex.
Yes, I think it's okay to share the screen, but it's not in my control to do it. Leilani?
You have it?
Okay.
You should have it.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to answer your question, I'm afraid, Alejandro, about what the world thinks about the WTO and the Ministerial Conference. I'm in no position to answer that. What I have prepared is as brief as possible an overview of my thoughts on the Ministerial Conference, and they're in 4 parts: the good, the bad, the could do better, and the future. And a lot of this has already been covered by Alan and Mohan, so I won't be repetitive. Now, for the good, I have to admit, the other thing, 2 other things before I continue. One is I wasn't at the Ministerial Conference, so this is a view from afar. And the other is that part of what I've said is borrowing from an assessment that Bob Wolff and I will be producing in the next few days. And so some of it is obviously influenced by his thinking as well. Okay, the good. I really struggled here. There wasn't much that was good. The obvious one was welcoming Comoros and Timor-Leste to be new members. They still have to ratify, which a lot of people forget. And they will only become members 30 days after they've ratified. And let's hope they do it quicker than Fiji did, which was it took them nearly 2 years. So that's good news. It also, some people have seen it as interpreted as the fact that people still want to join the WTO is that the WTO has some worth. I'm not sure that that's a big deal. There was one good decision, mainly on the e-commerce moratorium to keep electronic transmissions duty-free. It was touch and go, but it's basically keeping things as they were. There was some progress on domestic regulation in services. The deal was done a long time ago. In this case, it was made official because the disciplines are attached in members' commitments, in schedules, as they're called, but only some of the schedules were certified. And in fact, India and South Africa giving way here is sort of inevitable because the way services schedules have been, the certification rules for services schedules have been drawn up, means that they couldn't have blocked forever. And the other good, the final good, is about keeping the system going. At least nobody completely destroyed it so that it couldn't work anymore. There are work programs and there are some nice words in the declaration. So all of that's good. The bad, the fishery subsidies, the failure to fill in the missing piece in the 2022 agreement, I think is really bad. And even more bad, or not necessarily even more bad, but also bad, but receiving much less attention, although Alan mentioned it, is the failure to ratify and activate the 2022 agreement. That says a lot I mean, it's almost 2 years ago now, and that's still only words on paper and not in practice. And it says quite a lot about the problems in the WTO. Related to that, I'd like to know, what was this about? This was an event that they set up to celebrate the ratifications of the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. They needed 110. On that day, they were 49 short, I think. That's a huge amount. It looks to me like a celebration of a failure, and I do think that's a mistake. And we'll come to that. Agriculture. Again, Alan and Mohan have both referred to that. What was on the table in general, the draft, was simply a can-kicking exercise to move things to the next ministerial conference, but that's been ditched. And that's over the failure to agree on what's called PSH, which is basically over-the-limit subsidies in stockpiling. Well, this mystifies me. I mean, I heard you, Mohan, but there's a peace clause that doesn't limit India's ability to use subsidies in this anyway. So I'm kind of perplexed as to why this is such a big issue, to the extent that everything else in agriculture has to go, including the issues that both you and Alan have raised about needing to update the rules and to bring disciplines on domestic sport in general, etc. And when that baby, when the bathwater was thrown out, the baby that was thrown out with it was the possibility of new disciplines on transparency in export restrictions, which matters for countries that rely on food imports. There's also a question about the atmosphere in the ministerial conference. As I say, I wasn't there, but a number of accounts suggest that particularly towards the end, it got very, very sour. And there have been questions asked about the behavior of some delegates there. What about could do better? One is that there should have been a lot more on WTO reform. And again, Alan has spoken a lot about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail, although it is fairly important to note that the ministers acknowledged that the reform by doing, which is reforming in the practices of the various committees that deal with transparency and review and implementation and all that. And one takeaway I take from that is that if they don't need a ministerial decision and they don't need a general council decision, then they can just go ahead and do it. Reforming dispute settlement, again, Alan has spoken a lot about that. I just note that the deadline is this year. It was never going to be at the ministerial conference, but it seems that this is unlikely to be resolved, particularly in this election year in the US, but I don't know how long it would take anyway. Reforming negotiations. Again, we've heard quite a lot about that already. And one of the issues is, if multilateral negotiations are blocked, how do you resolve that? Is there some way of improving the situation with multilateral negotiations? And if not, is plurilateralism the answer? And the question here about the the investment facilitation agreement is, in fact, in the ministerial conference, South Africa did not sign on to India's proposal to block adding the agreement to the WTO agreements. And noticeably, the statement that India issued said that they objected to doing it at the ministerial conference. So that sort of leaves question marks about whether that's going to be possible when they bring it back here to Geneva. We'll see. The last could do better bit is about managing time and activities. And the first point I would make is that the members have to take the blame for this, because they left Geneva giving ministers far too much to do. But once they were there, the time was not managed well. The organizers hadn't prepared for how much was going to be needed on substance. So we had a lot of glitz and PR and events. Even when they had allocated time, it didn't seem practical. For example, there were 2 conversations, 2 to 3 hours, on very broad subjects, which are very important. Some of the challenges that Alan had mentioned, including industrial policy and subsidies and so on. They were given 2 hours or 3 hours each with about 100 ministers in the room. I mean, you really cannot have conversations in that kind of situation. And some delegates have told us that there was too little time given to the substance on fish, on agriculture, and so on. So maybe that needs to be thought through a bit more. So what about the future finally? One is that that members can keep talking, and they should. Even if they don't have mandates from the ministerial conference, they should, and I expect they will, even if that means continuing to do it plurilaterally on things like industrial policy, industrial subsidies, and sustainability, and so on. There ought to be time used to thinking about how to bring opposing views on board so that it's easier to achieve consensus without haranguing each other all the time about what everybody else is doing wrong and why they haven't understood my particular position on certain things. There should definitely be more thought given to how future ministerial conferences are organized. What is the purpose of those ministerial conferences and how should the time be spent? And they should tone down the PR because it affects credibility. If you celebrate the ratifications of fisheries subsidies or the fisheries subsidies agreement when you're, I think, if I remember, 49 short, then it doesn't really help with your credibility. And I have been wondering whether the DG being so positive about everything all the time was supposed to encourage members to be friendly with each other and to be constructive and to compromise and to be creative. It doesn't seem to have worked. And that's my contribution for today.
Thank you. Fantastic. Anabel tells me that she's in the car, but she got disconnected. I was about to give her the floor, but she's disconnected. So, does any of you, Alan, Mohan, want to say anything before we turn to questions and answers?
Yes, Alejandro,
Okay.
two things about India. One, it's not an argument that can possibly be concluded today, but I fundamentally disagree with Alan. I agree with him on everything else, but just on one thing I fundamentally disagree, that the WTO is not about policy space. You simply cannot do it, Alan, in my view, because you're talking about countries at various stages of development. The number of people in poverty are different, least developed, emerging, developing, developed. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach in the WTO. It'll be doomed to fail. I have an additional problem with the agriculture agreement. It actually militates against the SDG goal of no hunger. And nobody has pointed out so far. I propose to write something about it. If developing and least developed countries implement the agriculture agreement as it exists now, they will not be able to meet the SDG goal. I'm absolutely convinced that this can be proved, actually. So on policy space, I disagree with you. On other things, I agree with you. Peter, a number of good points, especially the one on peace clause. Why is India not happy with it? I think India is looking for legal certainty, and I'm not sure peace clause does it, frankly, especially when the dispute settlement mechanism is itself under a cloud. What if the whole thing is overturned and you have a completely different procedure? Some brilliant American lawyer will come and say, hey, this peace clause applied to the old system, not the new one. I don't know. These are some of the things that India worries about. As I said, agriculture is a deal breaker for India, even more than fisheries. And frankly, if there is, I'm not saying this for posturing. That is something I used to do as a negotiator. Full disclosure, I don't do it anymore. I'm not obliged to do it anymore. I don't belong to the government like you, Alan. I don't have anything to do with my government. But if there is one issue on which India will walk out, it will be agriculture. Make absolutely no mistake. Doesn't matter whether it is the Modi government or any other government. It is simply unacceptable politically. No government can accept it. So that's a real problem I see. And that agreement needs to be fundamentally renegotiated, frankly. I still feel strongly about that particular issue. And on negotiations, Peter, India holding out, I believe the US is holding out as well, isn't it? On plurilateral negotiations. That is my sense. So it's not just India. I'm going to stick my neck out, Alejandro, and then I will shut up. I think if the dispute settlement mechanism can be restored, I think India can look at plurilateral negotiations much more favorably. That is my sense, because it gives us legal certainty. And also there is a two-step procedure. It brings security and predictability. And those who want to participate will participate, but at least we have but this business of both the dispute settlement mechanism and the negotiating function of the WTO, both are up in the air. That, I think, leads to a fundamental change in the rights and obligations of countries, frankly. It's simply not the bargain, as I understand it, which flew out of the Uruguay round. We are now so far removed from the balance of rights and obligations as it was concluded in 95, with the negotiating function changing and the dispute settlement mechanism collapsing. There is really no balance of rights and obligations for members. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Mohan. I understand you'll have to leave shortly. So let me thank you profusely for your participation. But you're welcome to stay with us if you can. Now, Anabel is now in a position to give us her views, maybe without a video, but we'll try. Anabel, I'll give you the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So first of all, thank you very much for having me and for the flexibility. I'm in a car right now, which is why I'm not sort of putting on the video. So I've listened to most of the conversation so far, and I don't have major disagreements with some of the things that have been said, but I do want to take a step back and sort of recall what is obvious, but that I think should inform the way in which we look at the results, and that is the context. The context we all know it's a context of geopolitical tensions and trade skepticism. So the fact that ministers come together and express their value for the organization, as did very much the private sector and other stakeholders that were present, I think is no minor thing. The second point also about context that I want to again remind everyone, and many of you have been to many ministerials before, which is that this conferences take a life of their own. They are really very unpredictable events. You may prepare them well in advance, and nevertheless anything can happen, and they're very highly charged in environments. So the fact that this transferred with some agreements in this context, I do think it's something that needs to be recognized. Now, in terms of the results, like others, of course, I see some agreements, no breakdowns, and more work ahead. On some agreements, as Peter was saying, the extension of the moratorium, that's a good thing. To me, in terms of the language, is this going to expire or not? Is there going to be drama in 2 years or not? I think the important point to focus right now is that this moratorium, which is something very important for the digital economy, was extended. Welcoming Comoro and Timor-Leste, of course, is also very good. I keep reminding people that not only is the membership growing, but there is no one member that has shown any interest in departing. And that is also important. And then I'm also quite positive on, of course, the services domestic regulation. That I think, as Peter was saying, was relatively easy to do. But I'm also bullish on the investment facilitation for development agreement, because even as members need to continue to debate how to formally incorporate it in the WTO, I do think that members, the 123 members, government that joined the agreement, can begin to implement the agreement. And I see this in a way similar to the trade facilitation agreement, which is it can be an anchor for reform, particularly for those governments who are keen on slashing red tape, attracting investment, and the like. And from where I'm sitting right now at a development bank, I can tell you that we are ready to support members who want to use the investment facilitation agreement, again, as an anchor to facilitate investments in their own country and bring in more investments. This is something that we know that attracting this capitals is absolutely essential to closing all the development gaps that many developing countries have. So I do see this as something that can be leveraged by reform-minded countries who want to attract investment. And I see not only the Inter-American Development Bank, but I see the World Bank, I see others ready to support with implementation. Now, in terms of what was missed, I do agree with others that on environmental protection in general, this is a missed mark. And I also want to say, okay, it's no breakdown, but it's unfortunate, of course, that the missing piece of, and I'm not sure if it's a missing piece, but a complementary piece to the agreement on fishery subsidies was not reached in Abu Dhabi. I also think that, the fact that governments say that they cannot agree, to talks on trade and environment, maybe because this was also related to subsidies and industrial policy, which I also think, it's a bit, again, a missed opportunity. But, but the reality is that countries can continue to have conversations. And here I also see some green shoots on sustainability with the work that is being done, in areas like plastics pollution, environmental sustainability, and fossil fuel subsidies reform. So yes, I missed the mark, but no breakdowns, and I think that's good. And finally, I'm surprised that people think that, what big drama that there was no agreement reached on agriculture or on dispute settlement. So on dispute settlement, I think that we all know that, that was expected. The outcome was expected in this case. And even if, you may agree or disagree, but the fact that negotiators think that they still have time, we know that trade negotiators rarely ever reach deals ahead of time. And more, also from another perspective, we also know that this is related probably with another discussion on national security. And on agriculture, quite frankly, my sense is that this is absolutely critical for many countries, but it was too tall in order to expect convergence in this area at MC13. I think a major rethink is needed for the future in this area. So to summarize, some agreements, no breakdown, more work ahead. I think ambassadors in Geneva have a full plate ahead of them, and I hope that they can very soon start to tackle it again. Thank you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Anabel. Safe travels. Alan, you wanted the floor?
Just a quick, I don't want to be misunderstood, so a quick corrective to Mohan, who may be gone by now from our group, but I was not saying that there's no room for policy space. What I was saying, it's not the ultimate goal of the WTO to provide policy space. You don't need a WTO to provide policy space. You need the Treaty of Westphalia to provide policy space. Do whatever you want as a nation state. That's policy space. Now, do you need understanding for India's positions? Yes. And the goal has to be for both China, India, and everyone else, in my view, convergence, not coexistence. We're not trying to live with each other than in the interim. The final goal is to live by a common set of rules and to be able to, in the case of developing countries, afford to do so. So we have to sit down and find out what the real problems are of India. If India's position is, well, we need to subsidize as much as we need to subsidize, and we don't want any limits, that's not going to work. There may have to be different limits. Does it bother me to have a 25-year phase-in of, if it's needed, of artisanal subsidies for fishing? It doesn't in principle, if that's what's needed, with maybe half of that period and then a review clause. And on agriculture, you're not going to have a negotiation on subsidization without also a negotiation on market access. But we're not sitting down and having that discussion. We're not deliberating. In any event, I'm not against the need for policy space. It's just not the goal of the organization to grant policy space, in my view. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Who wants to take the floor? Hamid. And Jonathan Freed afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent discussion, and great to see old friends. Mohan, it's been a long time, and we've been sort of fellow travelers for many years. In spite of the age difference, his hair is still black, but mine has lost the color. But anyway, I will be quick. There's one point that I wanted to focus on. I completely understand what was said by both speakers with respect to negotiations. One of the things actually that puzzled me all the time is the reference to plurilateral negotiations as something new. Plurilateral negotiations are not new at all. They are common practice within the history of the whole system, even during the GATT time. Tariff negotiations, tariff rounds during the GATT time were actually conducted plurilaterally with a subset of the membership. So the practice of negotiating on a plurilateral basis is the system did it all the time. So I wonder why there is so much resistance to it now, at the time when, as Mohan said, there is no one size that fits all. In other words, with the increasing membership and the increasing diversity within the membership, there naturally needs to be more variable geometry in the system. So why are plurilateral negotiations now becoming much more difficult than before at the time when they are needed more than any other time in the past? And there are also situations which are quite puzzling, like the domestic regulation certification, which is identical in legal character to the ITA. The ITA was launched, conducted, concluded, and entered into force without a single consensus decision. There is nothing in the book at all which says that a subset of the membership would need to have a consensus decision before they launch a negotiation. So I'm still surprised by references to, oh, is the solution plurilateral? Well, that's not a solution. That's a common practice. It is done when needed. The fact that multilateral negotiations are more difficult now is another problem on its own. But I don't see this kind of substitutive relationship between the two. So any of the speakers, that they can shed more light about what am I missing in this picture, that would be great. Thank you. Back to you, Alejandro.
Thank you. I next have Jonathan.
Well, let me add my thanks to all the panelists and interveners. I'm going to simply pose a question to all of them, or a question in two dimensions, because not to oversimplify, but the message is from all of you, boy, there's a lot of work to do. And the question is, and who does it in what form? Traditionally, we've trusted ambassadors in Geneva as the plenipotentiary representatives of the sovereigns to speak with authority and have the flexibility to arrive at conclusions. Yet history shows that it's capital-based people at fairly senior levels that are sometimes needed intercessionally. Many of you will be old enough to recall the so-called Invisibles group that brought deputy minister level, vice minister level people into Geneva to combine with the ambassadors. And sometimes it's ministers themselves without waiting 2 years to get together. So the question going forward, putting aside the geopolitics and the election interference to come in many countries, there's 70 elections this year around the world. Do we convene deputies? Do we convene ministers? Is it in a G20 format? Is it the Ottawa group? Is it in regional groups? Or otherwise to get that dialogue that Alan called for going. So the question is Geneva versus capitals, officials versus ministers as sort of the two axes in terms of just how to regroup. So I throw that back to the panel.
Yeah, not to. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And you might have also remarked that 2 years ago, ministers entrusted the General Council. We know the results of that. And they, again, entrusted the General Council subsidiary bodies to do the work. Hector Torres to be followed by Lou.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting and very enlightening discussion. I think it is unreasonable to expect results from a ministerial where many of the most important participants are engaged in either hot wars or cold wars between them. So no surprise there. It was difficult to imagine, on top of that, negotiators engaging in good faith negotiation. When on January 21st, I think, the US may have a new president that depicts himself as a tariff man and promises to raise tariffs to levels that are incompatible with bound WTO commitments. So no surprise there. That's not the ambience that we need for results. Now, the question is, could we build up a minimum of confidence to buttress the possibility that this doesn't happen again, that the MC14 will have some results? And what can we do? Well, in the first place, I think that we should recognize that the WTO is neither responsible for development difficulties, nor an instrument that could be used to impose changes on domestic policies of others. In the second place, I think we have to acknowledge, and this is very, very important, that Asia, and notably China and India, have outgrown the relative weight that they had been allocated in the Second World War institutional architecture. They have both outgrown their IMF quotas, and they are no longer in need for special and differential treatment at the WTO. And so these two things cannot be discussed at the WTO. They need to be discussed somewhere else. And the only place I can imagine is the G20. And there is a possibility to agree on incremental reforms in these two subjects if they are discussed frankly. And I cannot see neither China nor India giving up their S&D right, call it right, at the WTO, if they are not given more space, more responsibilities at the IFIs, at the financial institutions. Now, the good news is that it seems that we are not cynical enough to agree on commitments, knowing that we can get away without complying them complying whatever we promise. And that's quite something that I would like to preserve. So that's my comments. I think that we need to look beyond the WTO, and definitely we need to stop asking WTO rules things they cannot deliver. There are many developing countries that have prospered with this set of rules. Others have not. The difference is not the set of rules. The difference is domestic policies. That's very clear. So we have to stop asking WTO to deliver on things it cannot deliver. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hector. Point well taken. Lou, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex. And likewise, a lot of thanks to the panel. Really great conversation. I want to bring your attention to the last point that Peter has shown us. I think that's probably, in my view, based on the discussion we have today. So it's about what do we do next, and especially what he asked us a question is how to bring opposing views on board. And I want to connect that with what Mohan has just explained about kind of very eloquently put as this so-called poverty veto, kind of dire political and economic situation India has. Because the reason I say that is that at least when I was representing China quite some years ago, and China was very similar to what India is now doing or saying. I remember in 2011, the Ghana G20 summit. So I was representing China in discussing the 1 or 2 paragraphs on the WTO and these negotiations. And then if some of you still recall, there's one specific word there say that about new approaches. And my instruction, the instruction I've got is simply delete it, get it deleted. So I was really confronting the US representative Michael Froman then, and together with the EU and others who were trying to insert that word in the G20 summit. And China was basically saying no to that. I think the new approaches then, in the eyes of China, means that no plurilaterals, no new issues except Doha, so on and so forth. So that's why I think that, of course, given time, China is different now and China has evolved. But what I meant to say is that behind the India position, there's a lot of things. It's like the US political situation regarding the dispute settlement, and I think we all need to look at that. So my question to the panel is really, how do we do a kind of like Jonathan said, kind of dialogue or kind of new format of discussion on this all kinds of issues and bring together different views so as to open the way for potential solutions for the way forward. And probably, as Hector said, that we need to go beyond the WTO itself. But anyway, kind of, at least in the WTO, what do we do next? I think that's probably the key question beyond MC13 or even the long-term future. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much. Who else? Don't be shy. Alan, please.
I'm happy to yield to others who want to speak. Just some reflections on really the excellent comments that have just been made by Jonathan and Hector and Lou and Hamid. How to move forward. No one has adjusted, and this is something that I took on board when I was there during the Trump administration at the WTO. No one's adjusted to the fact the U.S. has changed, has stepped back, and it has not come back fully. So what is the rest of the world going to do? It ought to find its way forward. I think Canada's idea that there'd be an Ottawa group was a useful one, but it's not broad enough. It's not forceful enough. The U.S. necessarily won't block. It won't be against in the final analysis, but it will not lead. I don't see that at present. And I don't know what happens after the election. I mean, there's a choice between does it continue as is under Biden? Does Biden change? Or does Trump take us in a direction that he threatens? And there has to be some serious discussion. And, you know, inclusiveness is fine, but 164 or 166 countries are not going to sit in a room and get some negotiated beginnings of solutions to any of these problems. So some form of steering group. There was a consultative group of 18 that some say was good, some say was not so good. The bank and the fund, the OECD is different, it's smaller, but the bank and the fund don't function on trying to resolve everything on a basis of let's have everybody in the room. Some Swiss cantons may, but an international organization can't. So I think that there has to be some serious work done at this point to revitalize the organization, and we're not on track to do that.
Thank you very much. Jonathan?
Sorry to come in a second time and to round out the discussion going on ways forward, picking up on Hector and Alan and Annabelle's reference to plastics and so on. You know, having lived through the development of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, it was intended to provide a new paradigm for special and differential treatment. It was intended to signal that rather than providing permanent excuses or permanent policy space, ultimately the goal should be for everyone to rise to the same level of obligation. But given capacity constraints, levels of development, the growing into trade disciplines properly should be accompanied by technical assistance and aid, to put it, and money, to put it bluntly, so that people could develop the capacity to compete and participate equally. That's a model that suggests there is important channels that need to be open with the development banks, with sources of funding, with a dialogue that accompanies trade disciplines and expectations, with an understanding of capacity, not on a freeze frame basis, but on a dynamic basis going forward. How many years with how much assistance might it take in agriculture, in services, or what have you, to bring people up to speed? That's analogous to what we now know is evident as reflected in the various trade and environment tables that have developed for structured dialogues on plastics, on trade and environment more generally, and so on. We need the science, we need expertise, we need UNEP and others to inform the trade people of the context in which they're working. And of course, we've been accustomed to that in agriculture with the veterinarians and plant scientists and others to give us good understanding on SPS and how it works. So I just wanted to add that on the policy space dimension going forward as well. So let me stop there.
Thank you. In other words, we're apparently have not been taking advantage of a new approach to special and differential treatment, as we should, in order to give enough flexibility to the system. Kessie, followed by Sherry.
Oh, hi, Alejandro. Good to see you.
Great.
Well, I'd like to confine myself to agriculture and possibly also maybe say something about special and differential treatment. I think The agreement on agriculture was certainly referred to, Mohan, as one of the most unbalanced agreements in the WTO. To some extent, yes, I think all the members accept that the rules which were negotiated almost over 30 years ago have to change. But it's also quite difficult because the system has changed. For example, the US, the AMS of the US is $19.1 billion. Now, India and Article 6.2 provides between 25 to 30 billion a year. So I think what we need is a holistic approach, but the idea that maybe we focus on issues separately wouldn't work. And I think the difficulties we have had in agriculture is the lack of trade-offs, because we managed to do export competition in Nairobi in 2015. Now you have domestic support and market access. And some countries, particularly the United States, have linked domestic support with market access. And in the negotiations, we haven't discussed market access for the past 2 years, really, nothing like on tariff reduction. So it's very difficult. So it raises the question as to whether it is the defensive posture which makes some countries insist on parallelism between domestic support and market access. I think the reason why we couldn't get a result in Abu Dhabi was the failure of the members to address the PSH issue. I think fundamentally, for most developing countries, a promise was made that a permanent solution would be agreed by 2017. And so the two options we had on the table, one, agreeing on a permanent solution at Abu Dhabi, or continuing the negotiations until MC14. And I think for a number of developing countries, not only India, of course, there were many countries who thought that, well, look, MC14 will come by and nothing, because at the end of the day, countries or members have drawn a link. Those countries which have high ambition in agriculture, it will be very difficult for them to agree to a permanent solution without modalities on domestic support being agreed. And I think that is the problem, because if we were to agree to deal with public stockholding on a standalone basis, I think we could have then had a result. But I think there was the reluctance on the part of most countries or the exporting countries not to agree to a permanent solution without seeing corresponding progress in domestic support. Now, in terms of the negotiation, I think certainly, I think Alan made a point that it's very difficult to have 164, 160. I think that is certainly true. But what we have also observed is that in the run-up, or even at Abu Dhabi, a number of countries, if you exclude them from meetings, then they will say, well, look, then we would not accept any results. So it becomes very difficult, in as much as we may have some consultative groups and others to try to help broker or forge consensus. It becomes very difficult because the reality is that things have changed here at the WTO. Gone over the days where a group of countries can meet and decide. But now, I think we need to be much more inventive and then see how we can get a broad coalition of views. Otherwise, it will be very difficult because, especially in the agriculture negotiations, we tried that. We tried to have meetings in different configurations, but we spent a lot of time putting out fires because countries will complain, look, if I don't participate in meetings on export restrictions, then we are not bound or we are not going to accept the results. So I think we need much further thought as to how to improve decision-making at the WTO. Now, on special and differential treatment is very difficult. I think I will speak on, particularly in the area of agriculture, where a lot of countries said that Article 6.2 was a red line for them. They were not going to accept any discussion. United States on this part said, well, look, they couldn't agree to exempting even least developed countries when we do not know the rules that will be agreed. And I think, of course, we didn't have an outcome, but it could have been a very, very tricky situation because I cannot see least developed countries agreeing to proceed or agreeing to accept any modalities which will not exempt them upfront. And I think this is the situation that we are left with, that we need to also be very creative on special and differential treatment. Least developed countries, I think they need to be assisted more. I think the idea that you can give a longer transitional framework or exempting them, I think there is the perception that the system is not fair, they haven't benefited from the system, And the response traditionally has been, we will exempt you or we give you a longer time frame. So I think we need to look at all this in a very interconnected manner. Otherwise, I think we'd have great difficulty going forward. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Really, many, many thanks for your views. And very good to see you. Sherry, and to be followed by Victor Do Prado and Patrick Lowe. We have been discussing a lot of things, issues around the ministerial, etc., and we will, in the future, I think, need to put some order and discuss some of these issues separately so we can go more in depth. But it's been a fantastic discussion. So, authorized by Lou, I think we can go overtime for those who are willing to stay. So Sherry, Victor, and Patrick are next in line. Sherry?
Thanks very much, Alejandro, and thanks to everyone. Excellent, excellent discussion and points. I want to basically just focus on the IFD, Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. I think this was actually one of the huge disappointments of MC13, because I think it was the one area where there were not any trade-offs within the agreement itself. It was a win-win on all sides, and blocking this from being annexed to the WTO, I think was really a very sort of huge, as I say, hugely disappointment, and should be explored further. And I think Hamid's comments in this regard were really interesting. Maybe we need a session on plurilaterals per se. They have been common practice in the WTO, in the services area and others. Why have they become so controversial now? We need to delve into this further. And Anabel and Alan both suggested that the IFD outcome should simply be applied. That the members participating, the over 100 WTO members that have signed this agreement, should simply basically act on it. This would be good for everyone, especially for those implementing it, but also for others. But then the question becomes, could such a precedent be used for other plurilaterals that would perhaps need recourse to WTO dispute settlement in the future if they were to be implemented, such as the one on e-commerce, which should be finalized this year. So it might not work as well in other situations. And I think that it's also interesting, we heard Mohan say that India is tying approval of the IFD, not to its substance, but to the reform of dispute settlement. However, if the US doesn't really want a reform of the dispute settlement system, as seems to be the case increasingly, this could be indefinite, and I don't think we should look for an indefinite prolongment of the resolution to a plurilateral outcomes for the WTO, but should find a way to move forward rather quickly rather than more slowly. So, not to solve this issue now, but if anyone has any comments, that would be useful, and otherwise perhaps we could deal with this in a more dedicated, in-depth session. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. Now, Victor, please, the benefits of your past experience and present wisdom.
Thanks, Alejandro. Thanks for putting me on the spot. I was not necessarily looking for the floor, but here we are. Two comments. One on the issue of the credibility of the WTO, and what I've heard from many people around me, not necessarily insiders, people saying, I find a bit of dissonance between the selling of the pitch or the conference in the WTO website and in declarations by WTO officials, and then what I hear from other people. I mean, was this really a disaster, or was it the greatest of all fantastic results, as the WTO website and WTO officials say? And my reply is probably somewhere in the middle. But one of the questions that I have to this fantastic panel, this is one of the best I've participated, is, do people share the view that perhaps a more circumspect type of communication strategy by the WTO might that increase the credibility? I sometimes find that, this great hype does not really help the credibility of the organization. That's the first comment. The second comment is, and it came to my mind when I was listening to Edwini's intervention. It seems like people have forgotten how to do positive trade-offs. When one country says, I will give you this if you give me that, that's one way of negotiating. But if you keep on insisting, I will not give you this unless you give me that, what we call hostage taking, then that's very destructive. You're not going to get anywhere. And it seems like these type of negative linkages are becoming too frequently. And if I recall well, and Hamid is right, plurilaterals were there historically, but 2017 Buenos Aires was one moment when people were saying, okay, enough of hostage taking. We saw what happened with the trade facilitation protocol. I won't give you this unless you give me that. We know who that is. This hostage taking has to stop. We're going to do the JSIs. That was the reason. And it seems like this is being taken to extremes now. The organization cannot work with this type of approach, this type of negative approach to trade-off. So unless we find positive approaches to trade-off, again, it's going to be difficult. And I cannot help but say to my good friend Edwini, yes, there was a promise to do a permanent solution to the PSH. There has been a promise to reform agriculture, at least since the beginning of the Uruguay round. So there we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing up those two things. And on your question of the circumspect communications to help the credibility, it would perhaps be a good idea to listen from Peter. But before that, Patrick Lowe, we can have no serious discussion without Patrick's view.
You forced me to take the floor, but I'll try and forgive you for that over time. It did the same to you, Victor, I believe. I just actually wanted to ask Mohan. I wanted to propose to, or suggest to Mohan that the problem that India has with JSIs is fundamentally that allowing JSIs weakens the possibility of exercising a veto under the guise of the need for consensus. And what the JSIs do is to remove the need for consensus. So, but the JSIs don't take away, they're not exclusive. They don't exclude anybody. They're an MFN. And really, if you look at it like that, and nobody's pressuring you to do something and you don't particularly want to do it, you'll get the windfall gains from it anyway, and nobody will ask you to do anything else. So how does it unbalance negotiating, the power base of different countries in the WTO? So I've really never understood that. I wanted to ask him, but he had to go anyway, so I didn't. The other thing is, it seems to me that we've talked a lot about the need to do something about special and differential treatment, but never give it much thought. And so, but if we look over the years, special and differential treatment and disagreements over it has been in no small way has held up business time and time again. And I just wanted to suggest one possible way of entering into this conversation that could make it easier. Let's distinguish between rules, the regulatory part of the WTO and the market access part of the WTO. In the regulatory part, there's SDT, all right, but there is also the presumption of convergence. Everyone will eventually converge to the same set of rules. So where's the problem? Everyone can negotiate those rules. I don't see where the problem is. So why do you want to veto them? And sorry. And as far as market access is concerned, we're never going to get to free trade. We're never going to converge. Everyone has their particular interests. And in that sense, everyone gets SDT. So why don't we try and separate out these conversations? You can have a fight about market access, but don't roll it up in some notion of SDT. It's what countries feel able to do. Because if you look at some of the tariffs on developed countries in agriculture and labor-intensive manufacturers, I mean, really? These go into double figures, way up the scale. Is that SDT? No. Unless you want to, well, yes, and if you want to say that the rest is, then it is. But fundamentally, I think we should be thinking along these lines, and maybe we could break down the I think the exaggeration that has beset the whole system about how difficult it is to do a fair balance of rights and obligations. Thanks.
Alejandro, you're
Sorry,
muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, now, thank you. So thank you very much for that, Patrick. I think we should start to bring this meeting to a close. It's been a fantastic discussion. Before, however, I would like to give the floor to our speakers. We only have two of them left, Alan and Peter, for your last remarks. Alan?
Last remark is I learn from each one of these conversations, and I benefit from greatly from the folks who have spoken so far. We can't get to trade-offs without a serious conversation. We don't seem to have it. I don't know that there's even been a bilateral between, there may have been, but I'm not privy to it, bilateral between India and the United States, India and the EU, India and China, and other bilaterals on the basis of what do you really need? And until we have that, we don't know if we have a common basis to go forward. I don't think we can, the WTO can easily withstand another MC13. That's sort of my bottom line, is there has to be some real progress, and that wasn't it. Especially since it's teed up for not even having the moratorium on e-commerce being renewed next time is what's been foreshadowed. So we have a lot of work to do between actually in 2024 and 2025. And look forward to our continuing conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. Peter?
Thanks, Alejandro. This has been very informative for me. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions. I've learned a lot. I just have one comment on the notion of implementing investment facilitation anyway without it being formally part of the WTO agreement. And that is what you do with I think it's Section 5, which includes a lot of issues like technical assistance for developing countries. How does that work if it's been signed outside the WTO? But apart from that, if the question, I think it was Jonathan Freed who asked, who does it, what level and how? I don't know what the answer is to that. I've never been in a delegation, so somewhere in between, it's obviously somewhere in between the interactions between politicians, senior officials in capitals and delegations in Geneva, but it will depend on the subject. I am rather stuck with the idea, over where this should go, because the obvious solution is to talk. India blocked a decision on the deliberative function, so it's going to be plurilateral. That's what plurilaterals are about. Many of them are simply about discussing issues. We can only hope that at some stage those discussions will mature into something that other people can then sign on to. But we're a long way away from that. But apart from that, thank you, and look forward to further discussions on these issues in the future.
Thank you, Peter. Patrick, you want to say something?
I thought you were going to block me. Thanks. And I just wanted to say one thing that I think is definitely worth thinking about a bit harder. And I know that some people have said this, and I just did some work with Hamid where we actually wrote it down. The moratorium is really important as a signal, but its substance, its legal substance, really doesn't prevent you doing what the hell you like. Because it's import duties on electronic transmissions, import duties. You can use indirect taxes in a discriminatory way unless the national treatment provisions under the GATS, Article 17, prevent you from doing that because you've made a commitment. Well, as you probably all know, there are precious few commitments under national treatment in the GATS. So what it basically says is you can use an excise tax, you can use a sales tax, you just do it in a discriminatory way. And you can do exactly what you want with electronic transmissions, or with trying to replace the tariffs that you used when this was physical trade. So I think we should think again about what we really want with this and what we really mean by it, because legally speaking, doesn't mean anything. It doesn't stop you doing anything. And the fact that countries don't do it takes me to my second point very briefly. I think countries that have any sense at all will not do it because they want to be part of the new digital economy. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to say. Sorry. Thank you.
Food for thought. Thank you very much. Paula, for your comment, it's sad to think that countries have been discussing for over many years over something that has very little substance or real interest in it. Anyhow, I have to bring this to a close. It's been a wealth of views here. I think we have much food for thought, and I think this is a good start to engage in further discussions and exchanges of views on particular issues, and maybe also help the discussions about trade-offs, etc., etc. So I thank you all. I thank our speakers, and I thank all those who have intervened. And I give the floor to you now, Lou.
Yeah, thank you. No, just a quick word about the next steps for FMG. Probably, I think based on our discussion today, we definitely should further organize meetings on plurilaterals and also the other one on agriculture. We have not have time to discuss another important aspect, which is services, both plurilateral and multilateral. So let's schedule this in the next few days or weeks and then come back to you. So stay tuned with our invitations. And thanks to you all, and especially the panelists. Thank you very much. See you next time.